Bon après-midi tout le monde. Thank you for being here. The Iranian regime continues to disregard its irresponsible disregard for human rights. The women and the people of Iran have had enough of this oppressive regime. Les Iraniens ont le droit de vivre leur vie, de faire leurs propres choix et de s'exprimer haut et clair. Mais, au lieu d'écouter la population, les dirigeants iraniens utilisent la violence pour les faire taire. Ici au Canada, on va continuer d'utiliser notre voix pour appuyer le message d'espoir et de liberté des Iraniennes. Here in Canada, we will continue to use all our tools to amplify the message of hope and freedom coming from the brave women in Iran and all those who stand with them. Just like we will continue to stand with the families of Flight PS-752 victims. This week marked the 1,000th day since the horrific downing of PS-752. I spoke with families over the past few days, as I have many times over the past few years. I see their pain, their anger. Our government is relentless in the pursuit of justice for the families of the victims. Canada has some of the toughest measures on Iran of any country in the world. For years, we've been condemning Iran's support for terrorism and destabilizing behavior in the region, including by declaring it a state sponsor of terrorism. And just a few days ago, we announced new sanctions against 25 members of Iranian leadership and 9 entities. This list includes top military leadership like those of the IRGC, Quds Force, and intelligence agencies, those directly responsible for the brutality and crimes. Today, we are going much further. We're taking steps that will raise the bar internationally in holding Iran accountable. First, we will be pursuing a listing of the Iranian regime, including the IRGC leadership, under the most powerful provision of the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act. This is a measure that has only been used in the most serious circumstances against regimes conducting war crimes or genocide, like in Bosnia and Rwanda. This will make the top 50% of the IRGC leadership, the over 10,000 officers and senior members most responsible for this heinous state behavior, inadmissible to Canada, denying them access to Canadian territory and opportunities. The designation of a regime is a permanent decision. This means that more than 10,000 members of the IRGC leadership, for example, will be inadmissible to Canada forever. On va désigner le régime iranien, incluant le CGRI, en vertu de la disposition la plus rigoureuse de la loi sur l'immigration et la protection des réfugiés. C'est une mesure qui a été utilisée seulement dans les circonstances les plus graves contre des régimes ayant perpétré des crimes de guerre et des génocides, comme en Bosnie et au Rwanda. Les 50% des plus hauts dirigeants du CGRI, entre autres, donc plus de 10 000 personnes, des officiers, des hauts gradés, seront donc interdits au Canada pour toujours. Second, we intend to massively expand targeted sanctions under the Special Economic Measures Act to hold to account those people most responsible for Iran's egregious behavior. On a l'intention d'élargir massivement les sanctions imposées en vertu de la loi sur les mesures économiques spéciales pour que les personnes les plus responsables du comportement répréhensible de l'Iran répondent de leurs actes. This tool was unavailable to previous governments because only in 2017 did we expand Canada's sanction regime to include human rights. Third, we are expanding Canada's capacity to fight money laundering and illicit financial activity, as well as to crack down on foreign interference to protect Iranian Canadians and other communities in Canada. We will accelerate the work to to ensure that our agencies have the resources necessary to do the job. Therefore, today, we're announcing $76 million to strengthen Canada's overall capacity to implement sanctions. This will ensure we can move more quickly to freeze and seize sanctioned individuals' assets, building on new authorities we introduced in just the last budget. It will also support the establishment of a new Sanctions Bureau in Global Affairs Canada and new capacity at the RCMP. In addition, we are enhancing our ministerial directive on financial transactions associated with the Republic of Iran. We will restrict financial transactions with Iran associated with the IRGC and the proxies that support them. The actions we have taken and are announcing today are some of the strongest measures anywhere against Iran. To the strong, resilient, and proud Iranian-Canadian community, we hear your voices. We heard your calls for action. That is why today we're using the most powerful tools at our disposal to crack down on this brutal regime and the thousands upon thousands of individuals responsible for its heinous behavior. Our government will continue to pursue all the tools at our disposal, including Magnitsky sanctions. To the tens of thousands of Canadians who marched in solidarity with the courageous women in Iran, to the millions around the world who amplifying their voices and their message, to the Iranian women themselves, from schoolgirls to grandmothers, standing against this oppressive regime, we stand with you, and we will continue to. Merci d'être là aujourd'hui. Je suis maintenant content de passer la parole à la vice-première ministre. Chrystia.
Merci, Monsieur le Premier ministre. Bonjour. Le régime iranien est un État qui soutient le terrorisme. Il est répressif, théocratique et misogyne. The Iranian regime is a state sponsor of terrorism. It is repressive, theocratic, and misogynist. The IRGC leadership are terrorists. The IRGC is a terrorist organization. Today, by listing the IRGC under IRPA, and indeed by listing the broader leadership of the Iranian regime, we are formally recognizing that fact and acting accordingly. More than 10,000 senior members of this terrorist organization will be banned from ever setting foot in Canada. Anyone on this list will be sanctioned and prohibited from doing business or hiding their assets here. We will strengthen our crackdown on Iranian money laundering in Canada. We will not tolerate financial transactions with Iran that are associated with the IRGC and its proxies. As Foreign Minister, I was proud that we, the Parliament of Canada, with support across party lines, passed the Magnitsky sanctions law to hold corrupt foreign actors to account. We will use the Magnitsky Act together with all of the other tools in our toolbox to hold members of the IRGC to account for their gross violations of human rights, of women's rights in Iran. A little more than 1,000 days ago, Canadians were personally confronted with the brutality of this terrorist organization and this terrorist regime when Flight PS-752 was shot down. 55 Canadians and 33 permanent residents were among the 176 people murdered that night, many from my hometown of Edmonton. I spoke to many of the families in Edmonton a few days after that murderous attack. I'll never forget what that conversation was like. And I've spoken to some of them again this week. I know that they want Canada, their country, to do more. I want those families and all Iranian Canadians to know that our government will continue to take forceful action to hold this terrorist regime to account. Canada will not be a haven for the IRGC, for its money, for its leaders, or for their henchmen. We will continue to stand with all Iranian Canadians who are demanding justice for their friends, their families, and for all of the people, for all of the women of Iran. I'd like to say something very personal for a moment. For me, one of the things which is so remarkable about Canada is that so many people in Canada are here because they fled repressive regimes, or because their parents or grandparents fled repressive regimes. And what's really amazing about Canada is people who are here, having fled repression elsewhere, don't forget about that repression they experienced. They remember it, and they continue to fight for the freedom of the people who didn't have the good fortune of coming to Canada. And I think that is a huge strength of our country. That is what Iranian Canadians are doing right now. I am so proud of their activism, and I want them to know they are speaking for the women of Iran, for the students of Iran, for the people of Iran, and their government, the Canadian government, stands with them. Et nous continuerons à soutenir les Iraniennes, les étudiants d'Iran et tous les manifestants. Ils démontrent un courage remarquable en risquant leur vie pour la liberté qu'on leur refuse. En tant que femme et féministe, j'ai énormément d'admiration pour l'héroïsme que les Iraniennes, comme Mahsa Amini, font preuve face à une brutalité incroyable. La liberté n'est pas inévitable. Elle dépend de ceux qui sont prêts à se battre pour elle, peu importe le prix. C'est ce que font aujourd'hui les gens en Iran, et c'est pourquoi le Canada est à leur côté. Zun, Zindagi, Azadi. Merci.
Merci. Nous allons maintenant prendre des questions. We will now take questions from the media. One question, one follow-up, une question et une question de suivi. Dylan?
Hi, Dylan Robertson from the Canadian Press. Prime Minister, experts say that we don't have the capacity to enforce the existing sanctions. Can you walk us through how you determine this amount of funds, and when do you expect us to be able to have the capacity to carry through on these?
As Canadians have seen over the past number of months, whether it is on sanctions on Russia because of the reprehensible behavior in Ukraine, their invasion of Ukraine, or whether it is against the Iranian regime, Canada has continually stepped up in putting real sanctions on individuals responsible for violations of international law and of human rights in some of the most fundamental ways. That's why the announcement we make today of $76 million to strengthen our ability to monitor and enforce sanctions, but continue to push forward, as Canada and Canadians expect us to, on holding to account those most responsible for egregious human rights violations around the world, needs to continue. That is why we are using some of the strongest measures Canada has ever seen. We strengthened our sanctions regime a number of years ago and are fully using that now. And we're invoking rarely used measures that have been used against some of the most murderous regimes in the world, whether it was around the Rwandan genocide or war crimes in Bosnia, to apply them to this murderous Iranian regime.
I didn't hear a timeline, but I'd like to ask about the IRGC. Will today's announcement cancel any visas or permanent residency statuses? And do you have any estimate of how many people inside Canada have been part of the Revolutionary Guards?
The work that we will be doing over the coming days and weeks to make sure that this is the strongest possible series of measures against the Iranian regime and against the IRGC is fully underway right now. I know ministers will come before Canadians and the media next week to further detail some of the measures that we are working on. We have been working on this all week and will continue to make sure not only that these are some of the strongest measures in the world against Iran, but they are fully effective in going after the right people, be they in Iran or in Canada.
Next question.
Hi, Prime Minister. Chrystia on CBC TV. Just wanted to ask you, I believe this is not a full terror listing. This is a listing under the IRPA. And I'm just wondering if you could explain in terms that all Canadians would understand why this is not a full-on, full terror listing for this organization, please.
We heard clearly from the community and indeed from all Canadians that they want Canada to do everything we can to hold this regime to account for its murderous behavior against its own citizens, for its use of state-sanctioned terrorism in the region and around the world to go after innocent victims and destabilize neighboring countries, but also to ensure that nobody responsible for these kinds of heinous acts in this regime, particularly in the IRGC, is able to find safe haven in Canada, is able to benefit from holding assets or financial goods in Canada. That is what the community wants. That's what all Canadians expect. So we have looked very, very carefully at all the potential tools, and we're not taking any further tools off the table. But the reality is, using these provisions that have only been used in cases like Bosnia and Rwanda to designate the Iranian regime under these provisions that are specifically targeting at terrorism, war crimes, deep and fundamental violations of human rights, and genocide. This is the strongest measure we have to go after states and state entities. The Canadian Criminal Code is not the best tool to go after states or state entities, but we will continue to look at all tools we can use to do it. But what we are announcing today goes far beyond things that people have been asking for. Okay. Ce que la communauté, ce que les Canadiens veulent, c'est que d'abord, ce gouvernement fait tout ce qu'on peut pour tenir responsable le régime barbare iranien de ses actes de meurtre, de répression, de terrorisme. Ils veulent qu'on diminue la capacité de ce régime de répandre la terreur à travers la région, à travers le monde. Et ils veulent aussi s'assurer que personne de ce régime, incluant le CGRI, puisse bénéficier du Canada pour leurs investissements ou pour leur sécurité personnelle. Et donc, nous avons regardé attentivement tous les différents outils que nous pouvons utiliser. Et le Code criminel canadien n'est pas nécessairement le meilleur outil pour aller tenir responsable des États ou des entités, des forces armées des États. Ce qu'on a comme outil, c'est un outil qu'on a rarement utilisé et seulement dans les cas les plus graves, comme dans les crimes de guerre en Bosnie ou comme au génocide rwandais, pour déclarer et désigner le régime iranien comme étant responsable d'actes comme le terrorisme, des violations profondes des droits humains, de crimes de guerre ou de génocide. Et ces outils, ajoutés à notre régime de sanctions qui est parmi l'outil le plus robuste qu'on a pour le faire, va s'assurer qu'on arrive concrètement à punir et à tenir responsables les leaders de ce régime.
Prime Minister, my follow-up is simply a why now question. Flight 752 was shot out of the sky. You met with the families. You could have done it then. I watched you this week get some very heavy questioning from the opposition of declaring the IRGC terror organization. And now here we are Friday afternoon before Turkey time, Turkey Talk, as your party likes to talk about it. Doing this now, how has your message changed, and why, please, sir?
These are significant measures that require reflection and including further policy work, which is why there'll be a further press conference next week on this. But let's be very clear. The Canadian government and past Canadian governments have been consistent in condemning this murderous regime and in holding them to account. 3 years ago, almost 3 years ago, 1,000 days ago, when PS-752 was callously shot down by the IRGC and by the Iranian government, we committed to holding them to account. Holding them to account on the international stage is best done by working with other countries that were affected by that, and that's why we've been leading the international group comprised of the UK, Sweden, and Ukraine in advancing both at the International Court of Justice and the International Civil Aviation Organization changes and condemnations that will both hold Iran to account and ensure that they can never do this again. Unfortunately, as I've said directly to the families, this doesn't move as quickly as we'd like, partially because the Iranian regime has been absolutely determined not to accept any responsibility for these acts of violence, not accept any accountability for the violence they've done to Canadians and to their own citizens, as well as to citizens around the world. We will continue to use all the tools at our disposal to ensure that there is justice for the families of the victims of PS-752 and indeed Iranian Canadians who are watching their loved ones and their family members suffer every day under this murderous regime.
Tonda?
Prime Minister, you say that that's what the community wants, but you've also heard calls from the community for exactly the terrorist listing that the U.S. has done. So I'd like to understand, though, why you say the criminal code and the terrorist listing is not an effective tool. If the U.S. can do it, why can't we?
The U.S. has a very different regime than the regime that we were talking about here in Canada. And we have spent a long time looking at exactly what is the best tool we have to hold the Iranian regime to account. Holding states to account, holding state entities like state militaries to account is different than simply listing a terrorist organization. And that's why the choice we've made and that we're announcing today that we're moving forward on is to invoke measures that haven't been used since Bosnian war crimes or since the genocide in Rwanda, to ensure that there is no doubt that the Iranian regime receives the strongest pushback from Canada that we possibly can, that we move forward on limits and penalties for well over 10,000 members of the Iranian leadership and military forces, and that we ensure that Canadians, including Canadians of Iranian descent, are not vulnerable to foreign interference by the Iranian regime. These are tools that we are putting forward with a deep level of commitment and seriousness to demonstrate that we will not stop until this murderous regime is held to account.
How many of those 10,000 are conscripts in Canada? How many conscripts in Canada will be affected? Would you carve out exemptions for them? Will you evict them? And if this is all about basically being able to verify and enforce something effective, you've thrown money at enforcement, and yet Canada doesn't have a beneficial asset ownership registry. You've put that off for a year or so or more. Like, it was supposed to help you track oligarchs. You can't track Iranian leaders. How are you going to do it?
The leadership of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps in Iran comprises well over 10,000 people in terms of officers and generals and top leadership. The family members themselves brought up the 10,000 number, and we are happy to be able to confirm that that is a number we are moving forward on. As I said, there are more details to follow, but the essential thing is that Canada is using provisions that are some of the strongest provisions we have to go after states that are responsible for the most heinous crimes, be they terrorism, war crimes, or genocide. This is the tool for this purpose, and Canada is using it fully on the Iranian government.
Next question, David.
Yes, of course.
Tonda, you touched on a really important point, which is a beneficial ownership registry. That is a priority of mine. It's a priority of our governments. We have put it on the agenda and have been pushing hard on it, and we are going to get it done. You're going to hear more from us about that. And since you raised this really important point, beneficial ownership registry, it can seem esoteric. You are totally right to raise it in the Iranian context. It's important for us to have it, and I'm taking this opportunity to highlight your point because we do need the provinces to join with us in making this happen. So I'd like them to hear you raising this important issue. We do need to make that a reality.
David Baxter with Global News, and of course in some of the prior questions, well established, these calls to list the IRGC as a terrorist entity have been going on for quite some time now. Just looking at these specific measures being announced today, when did the work begin on looking into these measures?
First of all, Canada has been reflecting on how to hold this murderous regime to account for many, many years. In 2012, the previous government looked very closely at listing the IRGC as a terrorist entity under the Canadian Criminal Code, decided to list a specific body within that, but not the entire entity. And we have continued to move forward in designating it as a state sponsor of terrorism, in bringing in some of the strongest sanctions and penalties against Iran of any country in the world, and we have continued to over the past many years. Obviously, the horrific shoot-down of a civilian airliner 2.5 years ago, the continued repression, the murder of Mahsa Amini, and continued repression of innocent Iranians, from schoolgirls to grandmothers, protesting this regime, continues to motivate us to look to do more, which is why we are taking this extremely rare but extremely important step of using the strongest provisions under IRPA to go after, to designate the Iranian regime and the leadership of the IRGC under provisions that applied to war criminals in Bosnia or to those responsible for the genocide in Rwanda, and permanently, for the rest of their lives, render them ineligible to come to Canada to benefit from Canadian protection in any way, shape, or form.
But just to follow up, is there a specific date when the work began on these three specific measures? Was it a decade ago? Was it after Flight 752 was shot down, or was it precipitated mostly by the current turmoil and protests we're seeing in Iran?
I think we have long known that the Iranian regime is responsible for egregious and deep violations against human rights. and we are constantly looking for new measures, but it is only more recently that we feel that the measures that applied in the most serious of situations, either against war crimes or genocides or use of terrorism or horrific crimes against humanities, should be applied to the Iranian regime and permanently ban the top leaders from that regime, including in the IRGC, from ever being able to come to Canada.
Hi, Mr. Trudeau. Mackenzie Rowe with CTV. Just before the press conference started, Nike became the latest company to bail on Hockey Canada. You referenced a couple days ago that you're floating the idea that potentially you could replace Hockey Canada with Canada Hockey. If the board and the executives don't quit, how quickly are you willing to move forward on that?
As I also said when I mused on that, it's not the business of the federal government to set up those sorts of bodies. But it is very clear to everyone in this country, from sponsors to provincial bodies to all politicians, but mostly to parents who send their kids into hockey, who buy the jerseys for their kids for Christmas, who are happy to celebrate the maple leaf on hockey rinks in Canada and around the world. It is obvious to all of us, to everyone except those people within Hockey Canada, that we have all lost confidence in Hockey Canada. And the longer it takes for those individuals who are clinging to power in Hockey Canada to realize this, the more Canadians are going to say, well, why don't we just create a different organization to do all the right things that Hockey Canada needs to do? I really hope it doesn't get to that, because there is a lot of good that happens through hockey in Canada. But if these individuals continue to be deluded enough to think that there is a pathway forward for them to continue to run Hockey Canada, then Canadians will have no choice but to look for another structure to run our national winter sport.
In Alberta, there's a new premier coming in next week, Danielle Smith, and she spent the majority of her speech last night attacking your government in particular. How do you think you're going to be able to work with her to move forward on federal and provincial relations in Alberta? And Ms. Freeland, you always say you're from Alberta, so if you want to talk to her, we'd like to hear what you have to say as well.
I wish to congratulate Danielle Smith for becoming the next Premier of Alberta. I will be reaching out. I will be speaking with her hopefully in the coming hours to congratulate her on her victory in the leadership campaign and to commit to her, as I do to all Canadians, that I am there to work with premiers of the provinces to deliver concretely for Albertans and indeed for all Canadians, whether it's fighting the rising cost of living, whether it's creating good jobs for the future, whether it's fighting climate change, whether it's doing the things that Canadians expect us to do together as governments. I will look to work constructively with everyone who's elected across the country. Chrystia?
Yeah, I mean, the Prime Minister has said what our attitude is and will be. I do want to join him in congratulating Premier Smith. Our government believes absolutely in an approach of positive intent and in working constructively with premiers of all provinces and territories. And we've managed to do that. We're going to absolutely take that attitude to Premier Smith. And, specifically on Alberta, I think it is really important for Albertans to hear that we know we are the government of all Canadians and of all of Canada. And that very, very much includes my beloved and amazing province and people of Alberta. Oui, peut-être le Premier ministre aussi. Merci pour la question. Comme le Premier ministre a dit, on a toujours une approche positive, une approche constructive avec tous les leaders des provinces et territoires. C'était notre approche et ce sera notre approche avec la nouvelle première ministre de l'Alberta. Et je veux évidemment féliciter la nouvelle première ministre de l'Alberta. Et je veux dire, parlant directement aux Albertains et Albertaines, que nous sommes le gouvernement de tous les Canadiens et Canadiennes, absolument incluant les Albertains. Et par exemple, on a aujourd'hui parlé des Iraniens albertains à Edmonton qui en représentent aujourd'hui. Merci.
Je veux évidemment féliciter la nouvelle première ministre de l'Alberta et m'engager à travailler de façon constructive avec elle pour livrer concrètement pour les priorités des Albertains. Que ce soit lutter contre les hausses du coût de la vie, que ce soit la création de bons emplois ou le virage vert contre les changements climatiques. Je sais qu'il y a énormément de travail que nous pouvons faire ensemble et nous allons le faire. J'ai hâte de parler à Mme Smith pour la féliciter dans les prochaines heures.
Dernière question.
Merci beaucoup, Kim Vermette de Radio-Canada. J'aimerais vous revenir sur les sanctions contre l'Iran. Il y a des experts à qui on parle qui nous disent que c'est évidemment des bonnes nouvelles, mais que ça va être difficile de les implanter, ces mesures-là. Est-ce que ça va être effectif rapidement? Est-ce que vous êtes confiant que ça va être quand même relativement simple à mettre en place?
Non, ce ne serait pas simple. C'est des mesures extrêmement fortes, rarement utilisées par le Canada, utilisées seulement dans les cas les plus graves, comme on a vu en Bosnie ou au Rwanda. Mais nous allons faire le travail parce que c'est important pour nous et aussi pour tous les Canadiens que leur gouvernement soit là pour repousser contre ce régime barbare et qu'il soit là pour soutenir les femmes iraniennes et ces gens d'à travers le monde qui se tiennent avec ces femmes en train de lutter pour leur liberté. Donc, nous allons travailler de façon rigoureuse mais rapide pour s'assurer que ce régime est tenu responsable et que personne de ce régime puisse, pour le restant de leur jour, profiter du Canada comme endroit d'asile ou de retraite ou de visite.
Est-ce que vous lancez un appel aux autres pays de faire la même chose?
Évidemment, nous voulons voir plus de pays dans le monde renforcer leurs mesures contre le gouvernement iranien. Le Canada est en train de démontrer ce qu'on peut utiliser comme outil, mais on sait que la communauté internationale partage nos préoccupations avec ce qui se passe en Iran actuellement.
Sir, given that you won't have a public registry for a while of the beneficial assets that Ms. Freeland talked about, will you require Global Affairs and the RCMP to report publicly on the whether there are any violations of the sanctions Canada has levied against Iran?
We have, over the past number of months, been levying massive new sanctions against regimes around the world responsible for horrific crimes, whether it's the illegal Russian invasion of Ukraine, sanctioning Russian leadership, Russian business leaders, Russian actors, whether it's these measures against Iran. Canada is developing and has developed significant tools in terms of being able to enforce these sanctions to ensure that nobody gets to benefit from Canada, our stability, our openness, our freedoms, when they are responsible for horrific crimes elsewhere in the world. Merci beaucoup tout le monde.
That concludes today's press conference.
Merci tout le monde.